Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski. Today on the podcast, we're in Colorado, and we only have so much time, so I'm not going to spend the entire podcast episode introducing our runner. Let's say in the 1970s, from that era, there are a few names that any sports fan in North America knows associated with track and road racing. We have Free, Shorter, Rogers, and anyone who actually ran, anyone who's involved in the sport knows the name Benji Durden. Not only was he part of one of the greatest eras of U.S. distance running, he helped define it. The list is long. I'm just going to mention a few highlights. World record holder on the podium at Boston Marathon, world championship team, U.S. competed in Russia, set a world record in the 24-hour relay. It just goes on and on. We're going to get these stories. Fortunately, Benji has done a lot of writing, and you can read up some of his first-person accounts of some of these adventures. And we'll talk today on just some of the stories with our guest, Benji Durden. Hi, Benji.
Good morning.
Okay. What was your origin story with running? When, where, and how did you get started?
Like a lot of young people, I wanted to do something besides academics. I was a good academic, but you don't get a lot of peer response from that. So I tried out various sports. I tried baseball, and I was okay at it, but I didn't like the fastball coming by my head with no helmets back then. So I became a statistician for baseball. Then I played flag football, and I was pretty good at that because I was quick. But when they started doing full body hits, I wasn't as good as that. I tried pole vaulting, and that became obvious to be too dangerous when people around me got injured from a breaking pole. I was a decent swimmer, but not a great swimmer. I never really could master the flip kick. And also getting up at 5 a.m. to get in the pool wasn't something I really enjoyed. So I started running track. In my first season of track, I wasn't that good. I ran the 600 yard. We had a dog leg. We were straight out and then around the curve. It wasn't 660, it was 600 yard. And I barely broke 2 minutes my first season. Then the President's Council on Physical Fitness made an impact on me. President Kennedy threw that in there. And there was a 600 yard shuttle run. And the next year, I don't know what possessed me, but I started running that hard every PE class. And we had it 5 days a week. And my goal was to win my PE class every day. And I got pretty good at that. I think possibly doing that is what got me better at other races. Jim Ryan was coming along at the time, and that sort of was, I thought, if he can do that, maybe I can. And that season, I ran a 5-minute mile. And of course, in California, where I was, a 5-minute mile was not really that impressive.
What grade was your 5-minute mile?
That would have been 9th grade. Junior high went through to the 9th grade. So that was my last year of junior high. And that year, I also left California and moved to South Georgia. And in South Georgia, I had a choice. I could be focused on the band, which I was a decent band. I played French horn. I was decent. I was second chair in California. And I got to Georgia, and I didn't have to practice to be first chair. And I lost a little bit of my impetus. But I still hadn't decided about track. And then I discovered that the school record was 5:05. And 5:05, I could do that, and I could get a letter jacket. And so I did that and ran, I think it was 4:57, 4:54, 4:55, something like that. And I pressed the school record holder down to 4:54. So he improved. But then that's how I got started.
Put this in terms of your psyche in doing this. We're all looking for our identity. You're pretty active. Good in school's not that much of an academic challenge. What about this competitive thing? You go out for team sports and swimming and track. They're individual things. And you're looking at, I want to win PE. I want to set the record. How did that competition inform you and what would happen later? And how important was it to you?
Oh, I was a competitor. I wasn't doing this because I did not enjoy it. I wasn't where people are today, where they say, okay, I'm doing this because I enjoy it. And I still enjoy running. I've always enjoyed running. And I've had conversations with some of my peers that say, oh, no, that wasn't why I did it. But I wanted the attention. I was an Air Force brat. And so I didn't have a lot of social contacts when I moved to Georgia. A lot of the people there were cousins or even distant relatives. So I was related to a lot of them, but I didn't know them. And in school, being the star student, basically, people knew me and were friendly, but I wasn't in the group.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be good and make a mark in the world. And I found that running was where I could do that. I didn't have a lot of coaching to make me as good as I could be, but I did as well as I could given the coaching I had over the years.
Frank Shorter said, how'd you know you were a 430 miler? Everybody's a 430 miler in high school.
Yeah, I got down to 436 and ran okay. I think I was sixth in the state meet my junior year. In my senior year, I got injured just before the regional meet and was unable to compete as well. I got third in the 800 and third in the mile. And it's only the first two got to go to state. And the two guys that beat me didn't go to state, but nobody let me know that. And the guy who won that year in state never beat me in college.
Wow. Okay, so you're not a state champion,
No.
and you're a great student,
Yeah.
and nobody was knocking down your doors giving you free college rides. How'd you end up where you went?
I went to the University of Georgia as an academic. I didn't have a scholarship, but this was back when going to college was an affordable project, especially a state school. And so my parents and I worked as well in part-time jobs, were able to pay for my schooling. A friend of mine I'd met the previous year when I was there was these secondary programs for good scholars. I was up at the University of Georgia all summer for a science project thing, and they invited a bunch of us across the state to come and spend the summer. And I was in the physics department. I met this guy when I was out running one day, and he said, you ought to come out for the team. I said, I'm not that good. And he kept after me. So that fall, when I got to the University of Georgia, I decided to show up. And as a walk-on, I made the cross-country team. I was initially seventh, and I moved up to fifth quickly. I was talented. I just didn't have a good history of coaching. And I got a partial scholarship. And I had a partial scholarship for I think it was 3 years. We had a coaching conflict between me and the coach, and I walked away from my scholarship. But that's another story.
And in your freshman year, like many people, I'll put me, comma, Dave Waddle in there. You knocked 20 seconds off your mile time in 1 year.
Yeah, maturity was part of it. And part of it was I was doing a little better training. In high school, if I had a 20-mile week, it was a big week. And I'd hardly trained outside of the track season. I mostly raced myself into shape. In college, I got better. I maybe got up to 40 miles a week. I actually prospered more from having a good, solid, long run later in life. I didn't need to do 100 plus miles, but I needed to have a good long run at least once a week. And I didn't have that in college. I think the longest run I did was maybe a 10-mile every now and then. I also was running my long days too hard, my easy days too hard. We were doing intervals when I was in college, 5-6 days a week.
Wow.
I ran so many 400s. I hate the 400.
That's wild. No rest days after an interval day. What were your events finding your way? I guess you thought yourself as a miler.
Because of Ryan, I wanted to be a miler. And then post-collegiately, I still thought I could be a decent miler, but I didn't have the proper training. And the friend, Bill Alewine, who had got me to come out for the team after I walked away from the team, said, look, your training's wrong. You need to do more of a linear type approach. And we tried that, and I got better. And I still thought I was going to be a track runner. This was like 1974. Looking at the 76 trials, I thought, okay, what can I run and make it the trial standard? So I looked at all the various standards. I looked at what I was running at the time. The Purdy Gardner tables were out. They did this thing to equate various distances. And I made a table of all my performances at all the distances. And it looked to me like the longer I ran, the better chance I had of getting the time. And I hadn't run a marathon at this point, but the only thing that looked like it was even approachable, it was 2:23, I think was the standard, was the marathon. So I proceeded to try to run a marathon. At the Atlanta Track Club, I had a marathon in Northwest Atlanta, and it was brutal. It was a 2-lap brutal course. I didn't know about this, but I went out, I ran 1 lap. I said, this is insane, and dropped out.
Is that the race you said anybody who runs a marathon is sick?
Yeah, that was it. It was brutal, and I wasn't prepared for it. And so I went back and did better prep. So in 75, I was running faster. I ran my first long run, a 5-miler at 5-minute pace. That was the first time I'd really gone beyond 3 miles, actually 2 miles. I'd done the 2-mile in sub 10, but not sub 9 at this point. I'm not like a lot of high school guys. I hadn't run sub 9. I was like, I think 9:29 might be my best, and that was indoors. Post collegiately, I was not running for the team at this point, but I was getting longer runs in, and I was doing better. And I decided I'd give it another shot to try to qualify, because still follow 75. I went back to the same course and ran 2:36 and change. And that wasn't anywhere near close to the standard, but I'd run stupid. The shoes you have there in your background, I put those on because they'd come in late. I'd ordered them for cross country season. They came in after cross country season. I was determined to wear them. About 30K, I took them off, ran barefooted for about a mile, maybe a half mile. And one of my training buddies had dropped out of the marathon. He came by in his car to see where I was and how I was doing. And his foot was a half size bigger than me. And so he had a pair of regular training shoes or racing shoes. And he made me put those on. And because my foot had swollen, I could fit into them. And so I finished. And it was a brutal day. It was in Atlanta. It was 30 degrees, really humid. It was really cold. And so I didn't enjoy the experience that much, but I got it done. So then I started looking around for other options. I did another marathon where I ran with a couple of guys that were trying to get Boston qualifiers, and they were masters runners. And this was 5 laps around Stone Mountain. And I wasn't trying to do that one for a time. I was just using it as a training run. And I did okay. And I felt good at the end of it. Then I went to the Florida relays. And my focus was on time. I wasn't paying attention to the fact that it was hot. And this is well before I was known as a heat runner. I was running 2:18, 2:19 pace, which was way over what I should have been trying to do. And I blew up and I ran 2:37, I think it was. And then I said, okay, I'm not going to be able to pull this off. And I quit trying for a while. But I kept training and kept getting stronger. You mentioned the 24-hour relay. That sort of was a breakthrough event for me. I had several things, 76 or there's several races along the line had shown that I was getting faster and faster. But that 24-hour relay, I ran basically 4:47 for 36 plus miles, or was it 37? Anyway, a bunch of miles. We're alternating over 24 hours, and that was like a breakthrough. So I went down to Crawley, Louisiana, and I quit trying to think about time. I just said, I'm going to run how I feel. And this is before we had Garmin's and before we had really decent splits. And it was a foggy day, a little bit of rain. And I took off and everybody else took off. And I don't know, I was probably around 20th at the mile. And I could see a few people in front of me, but they just all began to disappear into the fog. And I just kept running. And along, there'd be a body that I'd go by and I'd go by them. I had no idea where I was. The guy that I knew, and he's been one of my longest friends now, Lee Fiddler, I saw him race off into the woods. He had to take a dump. And so I went by him and I thought, okay, that's cool. Cause he's a mid 2-teens type runner. I thought that's good. I'm catching him. And I really didn't know where I was. And around 21 miles, I came upon Barry Brown. Barry had won the year before, I'm pretty sure. And back then, Barry was one of the top runners in the South. And I came by him and I had begun to be known locally. And he looks over at me and says, shit, it's Durden. And he dropped out. And I guess he thought if I was able to catch him, it was time to quit.
Wasn't his day. Yeah.
Wasn't his day. And I guess a mile or two later, somebody said I was in second. And I ended up finishing second in the U.S. Nationals, AU Nationals. Gary Tuttle won it, and he was well ahead of me. He was 2:15, and I was 2:20, 23, I think it was. And I was a marathoner.
You know Gary before that? He was a West Coast guy.
No, I knew of him, but I didn't know him. I know him
Yeah.
now, but we hadn't met. We obviously met after that race.
Let's jump around just because you mentioned taking your shoes off, running barefoot. You've had some weird shoe stories. Didn't Galloway give you some shoes and that led to you getting Nike?
Yeah. At the 1976 trials, they had the Nike Elite, which was a really decent racing shoe. First really good racing shoe, in my opinion. And they gave everybody that made the trials, if they wanted them, a pair of these Nike Elites. Galloway got some, and I don't remember exactly what size difference it was. I think his foot might have been too small, or maybe even was too big. Whatever. He gave me the pair he got because they didn't fit him right. And so that's what I wore. So after the race, Jeff Hollister, who had driven down there in a station wagon with a bunch of shoes in the back of the station wagon, saw me wearing the shoes. I wasn't at the trials, and he knew that. He said, "Where'd you get those?" And I told him that Galloway gave them to me. And that broke that ice. And we sat down and he signed me to Nike.
So you were part of Athletics West, one of the later classes?
Yeah, I joined Athletics West in late 1980 after I made the Olympic team. And I was with them for about a year. And the reason I was with them for only about a year is I won the Nike OTC marathon when it became the first marathon in the era circuit. And they said, "Well, you can't run the Olympics now because you're pro." And they dropped me. And so I got a better contract.
Let's talk about that overall then. That decade of the 70s, going to races, you weren't sponsored and invited so much then yet. So what was it like? Race fees, numbers, timing. Yeah, you didn't know what place you're in, you didn't know your splits. What was that like and when did that start to change?
Early 70s, I was in college. So I didn't have to think about a lot of those issues. It was being taken care of for me. Although I didn't always know where I finished. I mean, it was up to the coaches in a lot of places. To cross country, you knew because it gave you a popsicle stick and you could use that to figure out where you finished, or a place card. But my best mile in college, I don't know the exact time because coach didn't catch it. And I was outside of the official results. I was like 6. I think they did the top 5. And then post collegiately, if I ran a track meet, I usually got an accurate time, but I didn't always for road race. Road races, though, were remarkably cheap. I think my first Peachtree was something like $3. It was really cheap. And you got prizes. I've got a transistor radio from one of my first good places, and I still have that little transistor radio, and it still works.
What did you ever win food? I know Boulder, I think it was before you got to Boulder, used to have turkey trots used to give away.
Oh yeah, I've gotten food often. I got food, I got televisions, some of the weirdest ones. Televisions were a big deal for a bit. Airline tickets, savings bonds, one of those ones. But as I became better, I started getting free entries. And then I started getting paid under the table, which is, we weren't supposed to do that, but everybody was doing it. And it was even Olin Cassell, who told us we weren't supposed to do that, had done it himself. It was the nature of the sport. Particularly the Eastern athletes were all professional athletes. They were paid by the government to run. And it was a leveling of the playing field.
Was the money you got, was it hand to hand, envelope under the door from the race directors? Yeah.
It depended. The first time I got anything was 1977, the year not too far, I guess 2 or 3 months after I got second. Russ Pate, who was putting on the Columbia Marathon, he gave me $50 to cover entry or my gas in a hotel room. And I won the race. That was my first race victory. And that was my first money, $50. And I think it was just cash. I think he just gave me 50, like 5 tens. I can't remember for sure. But I had it a lot of different ways. Sometimes I would get an envelope from the race director. It would be sometimes better than what I expected. Sometimes it was a check. And they'd come up with we did a lot of things to cover it. We did clinics, and they were paying us for speaking, not for racing. And so you got pretty good at that. And sometimes you'd get a bonus and you didn't know it was coming. It was great. Sometimes you get stiffed.
You won the very first Cooper Bridge run.
Right. The day after I ran
Bridge.
Jacksonville River Run.
Yeah, I lived down there. That was the last time I did a race. I was in my 40s. I just ran it. But the Jacksonville race then, in the early 2000s, by then all the races had bands. It's got a big hill. How'd you like that hill before?
The hill was we actually had a number of obstacles. We started and went up a hill. And then we had the big hill at the finish, except we still had another mile to go, unlike what they're doing now, where you basically come off and you're done.
Straight down.
It made it interesting. It made it a more challenging event.
You got invited to Cooper
Right.
Ridge
right.
Run. And how'd you get? Did they fly? How'd you get
No,
there?
Jacksonville. And actually, did I fly it?
Sure.
I may have flown up. I do remember flying up now that I think about it. It was a quick plane flight. There wasn't any cash prizes, but I think I got some money to show up. I got money in Jacksonville and I got money there. We raced a lot, primarily because that was how we made a living. And so I had run, I think I was third or fourth at Jacksonville. And then I ran well at Cooper River. The funny thing about Cooper River, this is back when they had the old bridge and they had crossbars to keep traffic out at certain times of the day. And they come down and swing down and they swing up. When I got to it, it was still down. I'm leading and I'm thinking, okay, I can't stop and try to get around this thing because I've got to lead and I've got to go up this hill. I'll go well down the other side, but I got to get up this hill. So I hurdled it.
There's a couple of steeplechases you ran paid off. Yeah.
Yeah. It was funny, but it was a good story.
Let's jump around and some of the stuff, the background is just fascinating because your running has continued. You and Amy, your wife, have run marathons in every state, over 100 marathons, virtual around the globe. You've done the Transcon that Lazarus Lake did. You did your version of that. And you probably have enough miles to have gone to the moon between the two of you.
Between the two of us, that's possible. What is it, 250 miles round trip?
Yeah, 250K, 250,000.
Yeah. I've estimated I'm over 150, and Amy is in the ballpark of like 120, I think.
Yeah.
But a lot of that, we count walking these days, but
Sure.
My running isn't significantly faster than I'm walking.
Yeah. We'll get to more of the transitions and milestones, but some stories I wanted to just hit because they're different. I talked to Jerry Lindgren about his adventures in Russia, and you went to Moscow as a kind of consolation prize for the Olympic trials.
Yeah, it was the Goodwill Games. Ted Turner was putting it on. They invited the first three marathoners from 80. Tony was busy with his medical career, so he didn't want to go. So Ron Tabb, who was our alternate in 80, went. So it was Kyle Hefner, Ron, and I, and a bunch of really pretty decent track athletes. Some of them, this would be the first time I met them. My roommate was a really high quality race walker, and he'd been on these kinds of trips before, and he'd been to the Soviet bloc. So he brought along a water filter. And so we had a line outside our door where we'd be pumping water filter, people getting water. That's when I first met Steve Scott. He was waiting to get water. And that was interesting. They had warned us about eating meat because Chernobyl had happened just a little bit before we went over. And they didn't know exactly where we'd be getting the meat. So I didn't eat meat that week. I had 3 meals a day of overcooked green beans, boiled potatoes, and rice. And that was 3 meals a day. The breakfast was that. We'd occasionally get some bread. I lost 10 pounds before the race. And
yeah, that race didn't go well for you or Tab.
No, it didn't. And it was a hot day, and it got hotter.
What time of day did it start?
It started
at afternoon.
3. It started like at 3. We had actually gone over the course in a bus. We had to change buses 3 times. They kept breaking down, and they broke down outside our hotel, which was about 10 miles into the race, I think. The last time it broke down that I was on the bus, I got off and just walked back to the hotel. Not that it would have made any difference. Knowing where we were really didn't make any difference. And at that point, we'd already been on the bus for 3+ hours, and it was hot then. But yeah, it was really hot, even though I, at that point, was already known as a heat runner. I wasn't in that good a shape to begin with. I probably was in 222, 223 shape. And because I had been out of elite racing for a bit when they took us over there. And having lost a lot of weight, we didn't get anything to drink until about 10 miles. And they handed us these cups out of these big trash barrels, and the cup had grass floating in it. And I thought, I don't know where this came from, and I'm not going to drink it. And I began really suffering. I think I was about 18 miles, and I'm running along with a Japanese runner and a Russian runner. And the Japanese runner collapsed, just went down to the ground. And the Russian runner looked over at me and said, "I knew a shortcut." And we took off our bibs and walked a half mile over the stadium. And that was the end of it for me.
Wow.
Tab, I think, got a little further, but he did the same thing. Kyle finished and ended up in the hospital. I never saw him. He went home basically from the hospital.
Did those Russian guys know who you were? Everybody knows who you are now, and you know everybody. But back then,
Yeah, I don't know if they did or not, because this was in the mid 80s. This was past me being an elite runner. So I don't know. They mostly knew I had Levi jeans, and they offered me a lot of money for my Levi's jeans. And I ended up giving some away. I gave away all but like one pair of my running shoes. I gave that guy that we walked back to the stadium my shoes off my feet and walked back to the stadium barefoot. They were pathetic. We went to the Goom, which was their shopping mall, one day, and there was a line extremely long, people waiting on tomatoes that were only slightly decent. There was a store that you could go to if you're an American, and we went after the race and we bought a canned ham and some other, quote, delicacies, and that started making us feel a little better. But it was an interesting trip. If you complained on the phone, you'd call back to the States, your line went dead.
it's great.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the run up to the 80 trials.
Okay.
You had become a marathoner. You had won marathons. You've won a lot of races. By then, you had won several. What were you thinking going in, and what was the status of your looking to the trials and the announcement of the coming likely boycott?
We'd gone to the Runner's World race weekend, and that was at the end of the year, late December into January. And we'd been at a party for Dick Quacks, and we'd seen on the news, this was when cable news was just beginning, that the Afghanistan incursion by Russia was getting worse. And I said to everybody, you look, we're not going to get, the Olympics aren't going to happen. And I was right for us. I wasn't right. They did happen, but not for the US. But we didn't know, we kind of expected things. But in April, we found out we weren't going. So when I was going to the trials, it was the national championship. It was a race for prestige. And I had some decent races. I'd run 2:13:47 at Nike OTC, but I went out too hard and ran with the pack faster than I should have and blew up a little bit. And then I did it again at New York. And it was more of an accident in New York. Kirk Pfeffer and I, we didn't get a split until 5 miles. And Kirk Pfeffer and I were running with a couple of Tanzanians, and we heard the split. It was 23 something, 23:40s, I think. And he looked over at me and said, "We're going too fast, aren't we?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "So what should we do?" And I said, "We're going to have to slow down. We just have to slow down gradually." And he took off. I never saw him again. And I eventually passed the Tanzanians. And so I'm running in second. I'm running in second a long ways. I'm out too fast, but I'm running in second. We get off the Queensboro Bridge, and I didn't know it, but there's a pack of guys right behind me. Billy was leading them. And he comes up on me, and we raced back and forth for a few miles. He looked over at me and says, "We're leading, aren't we?" And I said, "No." I said, "Pfeffer's up there." And he didn't know. Pfeffer showed up that morning.
Creed Kelly got him in. He really wasn't invited before. Creed
No,
did a little bit of work to get him in.
Run Enschede, which was a big marathon back at the time. And they didn't think he would come because it was too close to Enschede. But he came anyway. And as soon as I told Billy that he was up there, Billy was gone. So I then, going into the trials, I had figured out running against the clock is not a good plan. I went back to my first good marathon plan, which was basically, and I've been running against the clock most of the races up to that point. I started running how I felt.
So and there's like a couple hundred guys. This is Buffalo. You're going to run across
there's
the border.
I think there might have been 180 actual starters, but it was 200 and something, and it may be a little more, but 200 and something qualified. It was like 220, I think. And you had to cross into Canada. The majority of the race was in Canada. We crossed over about 7 miles. We got off the bridge at around just before 15K. But I went out conservatively. I was seated 13th. I was hoping to be in the top 10. I wanted to be on the team. I hoped to be on the team, even though it was a team for name, but I wasn't anticipating that was happening. At the mile, I was last, and I was 5 flat.
Back to ninth grade.
Yeah, I was 5 flat at the mile.
Yeah.
And it's okay. And I worked my way through the pack. I finally got up with the leaders at 5 miles. The people, I think, when they heard the split at 5 miles, began to say, okay, this is a little too aggressive. And they eased back. Coming off the bridge into Canada, I began to get a hamstring cramp. And so I started thinking, okay, this is going to be a long day. I started telling myself, I'm okay in my head. I'm okay. I'm all right. I'm doing fine. I guess about a minute or half to a minute and a half of doing that, it eased up. And so we get to 10 miles and I'm back to feeling okay. And then somewhere between there and about 30K, I'd worked out who all was in the pack. There was a pack of about 10 of us. And so I had reached my goal of being in the top 10, basically, if I continued running well. Everybody in the pack had a better 10K than me, primarily because I hadn't really raced the 10K intentionally. I'd raced it, but not focused on it. My focus was training for the marathon. I ran a lot of road races, but a lot of them were just training races where I'd train all week hard and then run the race and then continue on. I wouldn't ease back for the race. But anyway, so around 30K, I thought, I got to do something. And I took off. And I buried everybody but Tony. Tony Sandoval came up on me around 22 miles and I couldn't hang on to him. And we had going into the last.
Could you see who was behind you when Tony caught you?
I could hear somebody coming, but I didn't know who it was. I knew Tony was probably likely. I thought it was Tony and maybe Jeff Wells because they had set the American record back at that where I ran 2:13. They ran 2:10s, 2:10:20, I think it was, in that ballpark. And I thought maybe it was both of them, but it wasn't. It was just Tony. Kyle Hefner was well back at that point. He caught up even more, but he was, I think, 13 seconds behind me. And Tony was about 20 seconds ahead of me. But anyway, we had and people talk about the pain of races, et cetera. And I never really felt pain. I felt fatigue. Pain wasn't really that hamstring cramp. That was pain, but the pain of marathoning wasn't a factor for me. But we turned hard to the left, went down maybe a half mile. I can't remember the exact distance. And then we turned hard to the right and we had another half mile to go. And in that section, I began to hear heavy breathing. I'm thinking, oh crap, I'm going to get caught. And as I made the turn to the right, I glanced back. I didn't want them to know I was looking, but I glanced back and there was nobody by me. There's nobody close. That heavy breathing was me. That's how
Not
far
a hallucination. You could.
Yeah, it was how far I was getting into. I got into tunnel vision that last half mile. I was worried that they wouldn't know who I was because I couldn't feel my singlet anymore. I was getting numb, and I thought my singlet had fallen off. And I kept reaching down to feel it, and I had a 3-minute and I think a 6-second PR because I'd finally run smart as opposed to trying to run against the clock.
So, what was the post-race celebration among you guys?
Obviously, we all were excited because we'd all run well. Even Tony had run well considering the nature of the course. And because it was warm, it was in the 70s. So it was a warm performance. But everybody wanted to know what we thought about the boycott. And that was one of the major conversations. And I basically said I thought it was terrible that the Soviet Union had actually gotten the games in the first place. I wasn't thrilled about the boycott, but I was glad I wasn't running in Russia or Soviet Union. And Tony and Kyle expressed the same thing. And when we then went on with our lives, in some ways, we're probably better known because of that. I don't know how many people could name the 84 team. And it was the same.
Not maybe on the women's side, but yeah.
The women's side. Actually, do you know anybody beyond Joni?
But it's slipping.
Yeah. See, that's my point.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
Kyle had some really good races after that, but if it hadn't been for that, you wouldn't know who Kyle was.
Yeah.
And Tony, he pretty much moved on. He went to med school. He took a break, come back, and he ran well at the 84 trials, but not well enough to make the team again. But basically, it's not a good thing, but it wasn't totally terrible. The track guys got really hurt. They were really damaged by it. But the marathoners, it also is part of what initialized our interest in opening the sport to pro running as opposed to just under the table running. If you take the Olympics away from us that easily, why are we holding ourselves out for the Olympics?
Were you in the discussions that were going on and the planning? This is with the Cascade. That was before you signed on
Well,
with
yes,
Nike,
yes.
or
I
what?
was actually one of the founders of that organization.
Okay.
What was it? We actually started talking about it well before 80. It was fall of, I think it was it was fall of 79. There was a training camp for potential marathon team members. And we were in Colorado Springs at the development center. And so on runs, we were talking about forming an athletes union because we felt like things were just not working out for us. We hadn't actually started thinking in terms of totally open, but we had begun. We had a meeting then at the 80 Boston. I ran that 5 weeks before the trials. And we met at Billy's store. We had a meeting, and we had meetings in Chicago. We had meetings in, I can't remember all the city. I think it might have been at New Orleans. And we had a plan. We had it all put together. And Cascade started because of that plan. And that first year, I was the winningest runner. I won about $40,000, 2 marathons and a bunch of other races. I had some of my best races. My PR for 15K came in that period. My PR for 10K came in that period. I was motivated, and it was financial, but it was also political because it was a political thing we were doing.
Do you remember how Herb Lindsay ended up being the name on the document?
Yeah, Herb was part of what happened, and I still think it was a stupid thing that we did, but he was part of the ones that got the TAC trust going, where you had to put the money away and you got it when you retired, unless you could show legitimate expenses. And I was one of the last to put my money in the trust, and I came up with $40,000 of expenses.
Was your account still out there when you got to Colorado? You were in Colorado in the mid-'80s.
No, I don't remember. It might have been. My wife actually ended up working for the Bank of Boulder, which was where the TAC trust was, and she worked for them for a few years.
That's great. Let's revisit the idea of the sponsorship and getting equipment and run fees. The world's different now.
Yes, very different.
Everybody could get a box of shoes. You weren't signing a contract, but so how did that change, and how did you guys pick before you signed?
I don't know everybody else's story. My story started with Jeff Hollister, and the contract was basically I got all the equipment I wanted, and I think I got maybe 4 trips that they'd pay for. And getting a free trip, because I was getting travel up and down the coast of the East Coast, but going to the West Coast was not something I got to do. But if they gave me a free trip, I could use one of those to go to a West Coast race or more difficult to get to race, as well as they would occasionally invite you to, international. I got invited to Amsterdam because of Nike, and I ran that in 79. And so initially there was no money involved. It was just equipment and travel. And they had a plan. If you ran X, you got free shoes. You ran X plus, you got free shoes and some trips. And it was a pyramid. And the better you got, the higher you were on the pyramid. And that forced the other shoe companies to do similar things. At the time, you had to really be an Olympic athlete to get anything free. When it started, Nike broke that open and got a lot more development going, particularly for road racing. I don't know exactly what was going on in track. And I've talked to people since to find out that a lot of the track athletes weren't getting crap. Ruth Wysocki, when she made the Olympics in the 800 and the 1500 in the same year, she had no shoe contract. She's getting free shoes because her husband worked for Brooks. And it's gotten back to that in some ways. I know 209 marathoners that couldn't get a contract. Now is maybe a 211 back then, but still.
Yeah, but we don't have 200 guys running 220 either.
No, we don't. And I think that part of the reason is you had that out there. You had that carrot out there. If you could run like 31 minutes, you got free shoes. You could run 30, you got free shoes and a couple of trips. You could break 30 and you got a bit more. And it got better and better. And so there was motivation to show up at races. Plus, you also got special shoes. You could have different colors. Nike made colors for the guys that they were giving free shoes to that you couldn't buy. And so if you showed up in those colors, everybody in the field knew you were special. And that attention, despite the fact that people like Ron Tabb says I wasn't running for the attention, of course he was running for the attention. We all were. And there's no other good reason for us to work as hard and put in the hours we put in. If we enjoyed it, we wanted to see what we could do. But if we didn't get the attention, why would we keep doing it?
You and Ron and Boston Billy do a podcast together. And there's some good stories with you and Ron. I don't know how good your relationship was back. Let's talk about Boston 83. And I don't know, you said some things and somebody put it in the paper. And
yeah, it had come from Houston in 82. So it was a long growing feud. I didn't realize there was a feud. I didn't know this was happening. I knew about him, but he wasn't somebody. Billy was more my adversary. Even though Billy and I were good friends, when the gun went off, the friendship went away. He was there to win, and he was a fierce competitor. Ron, at the time, went to the front and tried to run away, and it didn't work for him. It's just like me trying to run away at Nike OTC in '79. It didn't work for us. But I'd learned, and he hadn't yet. So at 82, I won the Houston Marathon. It was a decent payday, and I was serious about winning. And he was out there for a while, and I didn't even know it. I was focused on Billy. Dick Beardsley and I were racing Billy. After the race, what the reporter asked me was, I worried about Ron. I said, no, not really. That he usually does that, and he's usually not a factor at the end. And that pissed Ron off. But it was the truth. And I wasn't being disrespectful. It was the truth. But he took that clipping and kept it in his wallet. And so we're eating at Boston before the race. And he comes up and pulls that wrinkled piece of paper out and shows it to me and is huffy about it. He's got this. We weren't really friends until well after. He and I became friends on that Moscow trip. But before that, we were not, and you knew each other, but we were just acquaintances. So anyway, in the race at Boston, I had problems in the last 10K. I had a really bad blood blister. And I went from running 440s, somewhere in the mid 440s, to running 520s in the space of a half mile. Actually, probably more like a quarter mile. That blood blister was just nasty. I had a hamburger for my foot when I got done. So Ron comes by me, I want to say about 24 miles, maybe 25 in there. And he's moving well. And he taps me on the butt and says, ta-ta. And that was his revenge. He'd gone out rationally this time, and I hadn't seen him. And so he ends up beating me about 20 seconds, I think it was.
that race, apart from the blood blister, you had a lot of goals, and did you hit them all? That seemed like a really spectacular day for you, apart from the blood blister.
The first goal was to make the world championship team, because that was a selection race, and I wanted to be in the top 3, which you had to be. The next goal was to have a PR, which I was 2:10:41 then going into the race. And so I wanted to run under that. Those 2 goals I wasn't talking about prior race, because if you're smart, you don't talk about things like that. You're not going to be Babe Ruth and point at the stands. And the third goal, which was remote, but I thought it was possible, was to win. And I was on pace to get the PR, which I did. And I was capable, if I hadn't blistered, to be with, I think, Greg at the end. I don't know who would have won. He was on a tear. He had run sub 28 and sub 4 in the previous calendar months. And he also set an American record for the 10 mile. So he was really doing well at the time. I didn't know all that because we didn't have Let's Run and instant knowledge. But I knew he was fit. But I didn't respect him as much as I probably should have in the marathon, because he had spotty marathon performances up to that time. He hadn't yet committed to the marathon. But if I hadn't blistered, I think I could have continued. I don't think I'd have slowed down 40 seconds a mile. Actually, probably more like 35 seconds, but I don't think I'd have slowed down that much a mile.
Turns out Benji hasn't slowed down that much at all in the many intervening years. But we'll talk about that and many other things with Benji Durden in part 2. Enjoy. Hey, I hope you enjoyed another episode. Do you have someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast? You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel or on the website, running70s.com. That's running70s.com. Let me know what you think of the episodes and anyone, including yourself, you'd like to hear interviewed. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.